Hello, everyone. Welcome one more time to the Lucerne School of Art and Design in the Lucerne University of Applied Sciences and Arts. My name is Guillermina Noel. I am the head of Design Management International, the bachelor program, and I am also part of the Competence Center for Design and Management. And today, one more time, we are discussing some articles from the two sessions that are special issues on design education. We can share the links on the chat. I'm going to start doing that right now. We have today two discussions, very different discussions. I see that I'm sending these to the panelists. We will send it to everyone. There we go. We will start with the paper by Stan Ruecker and Juan de la Rosa, and I will invite Stan, Juan, Liz, and Jorge to briefly introduce each other, your name and position you hold, so that we can start the discussion.
Thank you, Guillermina. My name is Liz Gerber. I'm a professor at Northwestern. Jorge?
Hello, I'm Jorge Hirter. I'm teaching at the Design Management program in Lucerne.
And I'm Stan Ruecker. I'm a professor and the Anthony J. Patullo Professor of Design here at the University of Illinois in the Graphic Design Department.
And my name is Juan de la Rosa. I'm an associate professor at the Universidad Nacional de Colombia and a PhD candidate at UIUC.
Well, Juan and Stan, let me just start by saying thank you for writing this beautiful article about values in design education. I'm wondering if you might start by briefly explaining the work that you did and you described in this article. Stan, can we start with you?
Yes. So the brief was essentially to take 100 years of design, 50 years into the past, 50 years into the future, and characterize each decade by artifacts of various kinds, products and services and experiences, and designed, anything designed, in the context of what were the values, cultural values, being represented in those decades, and how did these artifacts reflect or exemplify, or how were they emergent from those values? So of course the first half is historical, and then the second half is more design proper. It's the generative end of things. And this built on some work that Juan has been doing.
I'll probably extend something of what Stan was saying. And I think that one of the main purposes of what we're doing is trying to move the conversation of design and designers and design and education from this. I think that we have the historic tendency of thinking on the next, right? So the next logo, the next cup, the next bicycle, the next car, and expanding it into assuming that there's a far past and a far future, and the far past exceeds the idea of the problem, and it's more set on the values, and that far future exceeds the idea of a solution, and it goes more into like a systemic future where everything that we do as designers has a ripple, an effect. So the main purpose was, try to get students to see a larger scope of time on what they're doing.
Can I go?
Please. So
I found your article very interesting. I found it was very rich. There's a lot of input in here. I see also to some extent different thinking about what the design function as such is. You take it from the classic design, depending on where you come from, object or service and so forth, and you make it more into part of a system. So it's the system actually that becomes the focus of interest. And at the end, based on the system and the values that you are putting together in this space, right, you will be generating a certain type of outputs, right? So the classic design things that happen at the end of this. Now this is highly complex, very abstract. Do you have any ideas or any pointers that you can give us on how we can take this into a classroom in a way that works. Stan or Juan, both of you have been doing this, so let's take both. Stan, go first.
Okay, so yeah, in terms of the practicalities of it, this is a lot of work. Even for we have 16-week semesters here, but even there, it was pushing them quite hard. One possibility is that instead of having them work individually as we did, we could have them work on teams. So there's more opportunity to go further on the generative side of things. The students themselves tended to find objects, or they would represent their ideas in ways that weren't sort of entirely their own design. They didn't start from sketching and then sort of work up to polished sketching and then present something. They would find photographs, or in some cases they would build little maquettes or little models of things. But probably half of the work that they did was not what I would consider sort of sufficiently their own design. So having them work together would be one strategy. You could reduce the number of decades, maybe just make it 3 in the past and 3 in the future. But the key concept of values-based designing was probably the most difficult thing for them to get the handle on. So I would hesitate to reduce the duration and then have them lose that insight. Juan?
And why do you think that was difficult, the values part?
It was something that most of them in the class evaluation said they just never thought of design in those terms before. They had come out of traditional American design programs, which are largely from the 1950s. So it takes some time, right, to sort of develop a different way of thinking. And these were MFA students too, by the way. They weren't PhD students. So.
These are, and also graduate students.
Right.
This is an exercise.
I think I also have a different perspective to that, because I think that I have the same perception on it becomes harder for students. And I think that one of the reasons is that they usually when they enter the school, they enter this rhythm of production of things that is so fast and so mad that is like, build something, do something, find a problem, find a solution. And I think that when you break that question, and when you break that process, and you say like, we're not finding the problem, we're finding values. We're trying to find what are the values behind the things that we do. It breaks sort of like the scheme, like the mental scheme that they have of things. So I think that that's one of the issues. I also found that, parallel to the work that Stan did in the master's class, I have done this work with communities and like finding values, building not as detailed, not as academically oriented, but more in the sense of producing to try to understand what is it that they want in the future. And I think that people get it. I think that people, once they go back and see like, oh yeah, well, we were thinking about solutions, but now that we see the values that encompass a reality, now we see that we can even reframe both the problem, the solution, and how it's applied in the time. So I think that in a sense, I think that the reason why it's harder for students is because they have so much structure. So much structure is already produced by the design process and the design education that we currently use.
Thank you for that answer. I'm going to follow up with another practical question, which is, what about products that didn't exist 50 years ago? So Instagram, for example, how did you help them? Did they struggle to think about what the origins of that were? And how did you help them think about that? We'll start with Juan this time and then move on to Stan.
This is a good question, because I think that the issue is that sometimes we see things in a linear way and we don't see things interconnected. We see, Instagram as, we have to go back to, internet and, communications and stuff like that. But then sometimes it's going, because the way we produce objects is not something that it's a linear process. It's something that's more like a generative process of like interconnection of things that sometimes we don't see. I think that that goes back, is sometimes going back to something that implies the nature of what Instagram is, rather than, you know, the technical process that led into Instagram. So I think that that's probably the hardest part, is to jump branches, is to go into a different part of the system and say like, oh, wait, so we're not supposed to, you know, search for the origins of Instagram, the linear process, but go into something different. Stan,
yeah,
what do you think?
For each decade, we asked them, you know, can you represent some of the key values from that period, as opposed to, you know, as Juan is saying, not the seeds of what would eventually become a technology. So for Instagram, you would have to say, well, you know, sort of, we had one woman working on kind of, you know, using Instagram in marketing startups. So for her, it was a sort of a vernacular marketing tool. And so you would look back, you know, 50 years, well, how were people doing that kind of thing? You know, were they handing out flyers? Were they putting them into mailers? You know, whatever it might be.
Yeah, so in a way, you're looking at basic human needs, communication. And what was the right or the approved or the good way of communicating 40 years ago, 50 years ago, at present, right? And technology there becomes an enabler. It's not what determines the value or the satisfies the need as such, right? So that differentiation is I mean, what you just said now, I think is quite important. Right? Because depending on the values you have, you will choose different technologies or different solutions.
Right.
Again, right? So it's along those lines. How do you deal with that kind of dilemma, right? Inside of a classroom where it's more or less theoretical. What you do there is a brain exercise in a way, right?
Yeah, we worked very much in a sort of studio way. So they were assembling things and presenting them and discussing them almost, you know, from the first week. So that gave it an opportunity to, you know, have everybody kind of jump in and say, well, you know, really I don't think that object represents the values that you think it represents. And then they could make the arguments back and forth. So that was, you know, we tried to counteract this, let's just say, very sort of almost theoretical approach to something very hands-on that they understood and could do already quite well, which was, you know, prototyping and identifying historical design.
Stan, do you, and Juan both, do you think that the exercise can help students be more prepared to deal with uncertainty or exploring or navigating uncertainty?
Juan, do you have any thought on that? I do, and it's because it's this notion of anchoring what you're doing in some value system that you think is significant. So that constrains the brief, or, you know, helps you to navigate through the design project in a way that wouldn't be if you were not being guided by you know, your hope for a better future in this particular way.
And I think that at the end, a lot of what we do in design, it's opening up the scope to get more detail and then reducing the uncertainty by using methods. And then this can be seen as one of the methods. It's like even going to values and finding those values is a way to reduce that scope and reduce that uncertainty on holding into something that can help us move into the future, right? So I think that it's still part of that idea of even though it's probably more uncertainty than common methods, because in common methods it's more like define the problem, find the solution sort of thing. And this one is go broader and then find the values and then interconnect them and see what that leads you. But still it's a process of reduction of uncertainty. Now, I think that and I want to go back to something that Jorge was saying, is that when they reach, you know, the real scenario of like work as a professionals, I think that uncertainty is going to grow. I mean, if something we cannot protect students from actually facing that uncertainty, is that we actually have to help them cope and manage that uncertainty instead of reducing it for them. So I think that in that sense, methods are really good because they help us reduce that the uncertainty of the process. But in a sense, it's also like, you know, trying to push a little bit students into acknowledging that uncertainty is going to exist and they have to deal with it. And in part, their job is to go into uncertainty sort of like with folded eyes and then see what are the paths or the different paths that they can take inside that uncertainty.
Thank you, Juan, for that answer. I think this year, if anything, has very much proved your point that we must learn how to navigate uncertainty. I think another thing this year, putting this paper in context, is the question of who determines value. And so I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about some of the conversations you had with the students about designs that maybe had different perceived values to different people, and who determined that. That's part one. And the other part is how does context influence value? So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that with some concrete examples, if you can share, please.
Do you want me to start one? So let me use an example. The student who had taken advertising as his trajectory. So, 100 years of design's contribution to advertising. And he produced in the future some things. He said, for instance, well, let's have more sustainable advertising. You won't get throwaway boxes from Amazon.com anymore. You will own a shipping box, or maybe 2 or 3 different size shipping boxes, and you will, the process will be to pass them back and forth, and they fill them and send them back. And the advertising aspect of that is each side of the box is essentially an iPad, so it's got a video display on it. And Amazon will load up, when they load up the contents of the box, they also load up the advertising that you're going to get on your own box. And you can't do anything about that. You're going to accept it. Another one he suggested was, as you're walking down the street, the sensor that's built into your skin or wherever is triggering ads as you walk. So, and they're put into your shadow. So they're always nice and visible on the sidewalk or on the building or wherever you are. So you can tell from each person walking around what they're being advertised with.
But Stan,
their profile.
This is good news. This suggests we'll still have natural sunlight, correct? If we have shadows.
That's great. Yeah, nice. The one I think that horrified people the most was they would put ads on the windows of your airplane seat. So the way we do now with buses, you sort of film a screen a thing on there, but this would just be a video ad that you would have to sort of look through in order to see. And for some reason, that just struck people as, now we're in a dystopia. But the student's interest, the values he was trying to represent were things like sustainability. How can we continue, not drop this ridiculous intensity of advertising, maybe even crank it up. I think he also put one on my coffee cup. So every morning I would get up and my coffee cup would have a different ad on it, sort of based on what the system was determining. Well, you're doing away with a lot of paper and garbage this way, but it's, the other student said, that it's too invasive.
Building on what Stan's saying, I think that there's a significance in there, and is that when you have to align your production and your intention into those values, then it changes the way you perceive things. Because I think that I had this conversation, and going back to this idea of uncertainty, I had a conversation with a PhD in architecture, and I was saying that we have to work on methods that allow us to see more of the effects of the things that we're producing, because in part we're responsible for that production. And he was saying, like, that's going to be the work of sociologists and anthropologists in the future. It's not us. And I have the feeling that we can continue on the same process of, like, we just produce, and then somebody will figure whether or not we took the right path. But I think that aligning your ideas with the values that you have as a society, as a designer, sets you up in a different place, because now you're not just aiming for that solution, you're aiming for farther reason for that solution in society, for like the next ripple or the next effect of the things that you're creating. And it is true that forecasting is an illusion of, and we see it right now. I mean, we thought we were building for the best, but it doesn't take the responsibility out of the process of saying, like, you know, even though I know that this is an illusion that I can forecast the repercussions of the things that I'm producing, there's a responsibility in at least trying to line it up with some principles and values that we have through the process. And then instead of like just assuming the problem and the solution, is like, go further and see, you know, is this lining up with something? Is this idea of like moving into more sustainable reality is something that we can put as part of the characteristics of the things that we're designing?
Yeah, well, that brings us to another issue, right? The solutions that you're looking at right now require interdisciplinarity. There is no way that as a designer sitting in his studio is going to cover supply chains and economic things and design aspects and so forth all by himself or herself, right? So we have this interdisciplinarity, and as soon as you have that, you have, of course, the conflicting values of the disciplines. Right, so the people thinking the business plan, you know, have a certain value that they are seeking. The people looking at sustainability have different value that they are seeking, and so forth. Right, so this mediation between those value systems is going to become more and more important.
I would like to say something on that matter. Is that I love some of the work of Helen Raworth on this idea, because I think that when you move the scale of the things you're analyzing, values start to line up. So when you see economics, and then you see like economics is about like a closed system of exchange of resources, but then when you take it outside and then you say like, oh, put it on a perspective, and then the values of sustainability, the values of social construction, the values of family, the values of basic values of humanity start lining up. So her work is interesting because she says, you know, if you take the model of economics and then you change the perspective, then the other forces that are usually excluded from the systems start to show up. And then you start seeing some of that complexity outside the values that we have taken for granted from different disciplines. And I think that that's part of the thing, both for designers and other disciplines, is that how we move that discussion into other disciplines too. Sorry, Stan.
That sounds really attractive, right? You know, in a way that's what we're trying to aim and do, but we fail because we don't have that overarching perspective yet. Maybe we need to go beyond that, you know, and try to really hash out all these differences to get to the core of it. In a way, that's what you're describing. I don't know the work of this lady, but that would be something to look into the future, definitely.
Juan, can you share something in the chat of her? We have a question from Jan Ecker. He said, some years ago, I developed a course for master students in design called Assessing Design. Aim of this course was to help students understand the value system behind their own master projects and create a set of criteria to assess their final project. Do you make similar experiences or exercises about how to assess own design outcomes with your students as well?
I don't believe that we do. I don't think that's part of our larger curriculum. It should be. That sounds like a fantastic exercise.
I think it doesn't happen a lot in design. That reflection doesn't go often in design because we're so focused on like the production of the things that we need to produce in order to learn how to produce them. So
yeah, we end up on a kind of a treadmill of production, and then don't take this time to look back. I would be interested if one could say a couple of words about the values negotiation you did down in the Humidel, but maybe we're out of time.
I think it's a similar process. The difference is instead of like going into the, you know, what we did in the class, what Stan did in the class with the masters, it was something more related to like go into your own search and find the values that you think are significant for that period of time. What we did was more of a process of deliberation and negotiation of like, what are the values of this community? and we kind of like collect them, map them, and then select those that people believe were more important in order to move forward. So I think that when you move that process with communities, and then you go into like, instead of like selecting values as something that is a given, because values are so relative to like groups and, you know, families, people, you know, and I think that the way we move forward is the process of negotiation. It's deliverance. So I think that they deliberate on that process, and the conversation of design was more focused on like, how do you facilitate that process of understanding what are the values that you have, but also the values that you intend for that future to sustain.
As we wrap up here, I'm wondering if I can ask a question from someone who has very little time, very little resources. I'm overwhelmed by Zoom already and distance teaching. Can you please give me some words, or give our audience some words of encouragement for what a little piece of this we could pull off and use in our classroom next week, and how might we use this and apply this brilliant work right away, given the chaos in which we all live today?
Juan, I'm waiting for you.
It's so let me give you some. I hope this is a word of hope on that sense. Is that when we were going through this process of like parallel to the process of the class, we've been doing some workshops with community using some of those methods, and we reached a point where you know lockdowns and pandemic and everything started, and we were like, okay, so we're probably done. I mean, with the whole process. And then we met up with the group that we were working with the Center of Community Innovation and Research from it's a community center that they work with the community group that I'm working with. And it was really interesting because we set up this whole virtual process where we contacted communities through cell phones, Zoom, Meet, everything. We use MindMeister, Mentimeter, different tools, Miro, and then we build up the workshops with them, with communities with low resources. We send them sort of like cultural probes, but instead of like just cultural probes, were tools to like help them go through process of prototyping and analyzing and stuff like that. And it was very successful. So I think that if we can do that with communities with low resources, we can do it with students, and I think it's possible. It's just like it takes time and effort, but I think that it's worth it in a sense.
We have some comments from Danielle Wilde, and let me start. What is the first one? She said, if designers consider themselves implicated in the futures they are creating, we have a chance of purpose-driven, values-driven design becoming more prominent. Do you have any comment about that?
So everything is a balancing act, right? When I was doing my MDes, we didn't have an illustration program because the director of the program said, well, you know, learning to draw properly is a degree itself. You know, we'll have a photography program because you can pick up a camera fairly quickly, you know, within a year or two. So the same thing here, you know, once you start taking them off the treadmill of learning how to make things, you're going to sacrifice a little bit of their quality in making things in order to get them to the point of reflection.
Juan, do you have a comment?
I agree with Stan. And I also think that at the end, I mean, one of the questions that we have to have is that, I'm trying to remember, we had a conversation with someone and we were saying that, you know, artificial intelligence, it's going to take a lot of the work that we do. I mean, nobody's going to care who designs logos in 20 years, right? But instead, we're going to have to be dealing with more complexity. I'm not saying that logos are not important, but I'm saying that, you know, the space is going to be reducing. The space for photography is going to be reducing. The space for production of things is going to go into a different level of like, you know, we have to address that production in a more conscious way. We have to address the production of objects, not only as a goal or as a solution, but also as a process, but also as a way of reflecting. That I think that's part of the work that from Stan that led me into the whole process of working with prototypes, is we can do more. And I think that it's not about looking down to the craft of a profession, but it's also like looking up and saying like, okay, so we have so much more to go that sometimes we have to affect some of that discussion and like the production of things in order to go farther and say like, maybe there's more questions that we can answer before we go back and produce something.
Good. There is another comment, and she said, without conflict, we cannot have change, and we need change. The question becomes how we equip designers to negotiate that process so that conflict is understood by them as being fantastically valuable.
I often say that you can take two paths as a designer. You can put your wheel to the direction everything is already going and just contribute to that. I'm always meeting the brief. Everybody wants X and I'm producing X. Or you can say, more like Juan does, well, I'm not that keen on X. Can I either, veer off in a completely different direction or spend some time kind of nudging X to, towards the direction that I think is probably a better future.
Good. So Jorge and Liz, do you have one more comment? Do you have other question, or are you ready to wrap up?
I'd like to make one comment now on what Stanley said, right? And at the end of the day, right, it's who is deciding what we are going to be doing, right? Mm-hmm. So in this sense, I like to use the model of a circle of influence, with the different levels of influence. And I don't know, I don't see who's in the room, but I assume there's a lot of students here. I encourage you to use your studies and your experiences that you're making to take the circle that you have now and to grow it, because that will make it possible for you to take more influence into what we will be doing in future, right? That's what this is about. If you have no influence, you cannot do anything, right? So a classmate of mine went to become a president of the United States. I mean, he had more power than I did. We went to the same school. So, he had a different circle of influence than I did. And that's what this is about, right? So understanding also what limitations you have and how you can grow beyond that, okay?
Jorge, if I may say to your point, I think it is also acknowledging that we have historically have some agency or have had some agency on the production of the things that we do. And some of the values that we have encouraged through time are values that are not even discussed by our profession, but rather just assumed and exported into the things that we build. And I think that also for students and for designers is a matter of like acknowledging that the things that we create carry those values, and we have to discuss what are the values that we're putting on the things. What are we filling up the things that we produce with? Because that's a long conversation. It's like we're just taking the values and delivering them to everyone without even asking what is in the package.
Maybe I could point to a comment that Ken just made about when I was in Chicago, we always talked about reframing the brief, and that might be a good moment in the design process to think about, talking to the client about potential other choices.
I'm going to build on something Jorge said about I like reframing the brief. Stanley, I also might think about reframing the team. So to be sure, not everybody has the same circle of influence. And so I think to me, this article really calls to expanding the team of designers and expanding different perspectives and elevating those who maybe haven't had as much agency in the past to understand their values and how we might acknowledge those.
We have a question in the chat by Monica Forero. I don't know if you can see it and if you would like to address it.
That's a really good question. And I think that it's part of what we do is like, or what this exercise is about is like the idea of involving the fact that people, or trying to make students aware that those values are there, whether you want to acknowledge them or not, that they are part of what we do, that once we know them, I think that, and that's the ethics of the same issue, is that once we know that those values are in there, how do we proceed with the process? How do we engage with those values? How do we address the existence of those values? And I think that that's a big part of like moving students to a different conversation. Is like, instead of asking the question of what is the problem, try to ask the question of who is involved in that process and what are the values that we're discussing with them, and what are the values that they have that we're working with them. So I think that that's part of the exercise. On one of the points of that exercise is trying to get students more aware of that. I don't know if Stan wants to say something about that.
If there was one thing that I could have done in this exercise that I didn't do, and this goes to Liz's point and to Monica's as well, it would have been to send the students out to do a value exercise with members of the community that they're working with, so that it wasn't just them saying, "Oh, I'm interested in X," but to actually go out and find out, okay, what are people interested in? What is important to them? That's not an easy thing to find out, though. So, I didn't think we had anything like the time that would require.
Perhaps it sparked an interest in them doing that in the future, Stanley. That's what I like about this article. Is I suspect if you interviewed the students who do this 10 years from now, you'll find that this activity influenced them greatly.
Oh, that would be great.
Thank you very much to the four of you, and we will pass now to the next article, and I will invite Juliette, Leslie, and Nora to introduce yourself very briefly.
So my name is Juliette Cezzar. I'm an associate professor at Parsons School of Design, which is part of the New School in New York City, of communication design. I should also specify that I'm communication design. Go ahead.
Okay. My name is Leslie Ann Noel, and I'm the Associate Director of Design Thinking for Social Impact, a really long title, at Tulane University. We have a center that focuses on design thinking and social innovation. So I'm in that role. Originally, I'm an industrial designer, and something that might be interesting, I'm the co-chair of the Pluriversal Design Special Interest Group of the Design Research Society. So I'm very interested in design from multiple perspectives. How are we doing things differently in different parts of the world?
And my name is Nora Jean Renaud, and I'm a student in design management at the Lucerne School of Art and Design.
Right. And Leslie or Nora, do you have a comment or question for Juliette?
Well, a rhetorical question, perhaps. As I read the article, the title of the article is Educating the Designer of Now. And my question really was, okay, so who is the designer of now? As I read the article, I wondered, particularly because I am always in conversation with people outside of the US, like right now, this week I was chatting with my friends at NID in Bangalore. I have a colleague at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa, and we're like always chatting constantly. So, when I read the article, I kind of thought, okay, so who is Juliette considering the designer of now? Is it the design student in New York, or is it the design student? I mean, it's hard to think of the design student everywhere in the world, but that was the question that I was wondering.
Well, which I think is a good place to begin. The prompt for writing these essays was about the competencies that a student would need in 2025. And so, which kind of sets up this frame of a somewhat undifferentiated student who is now being crafted into a designer in the future who has like a set of qualities, like a kind of spec, for this designer. And I spend a lot of my time really asking who is in this classroom, why are they there, and what do they already bring with them to that I can grow on. And why I say designer of now too is we have, or even I have a tendency to refer to students as like, well, when you become a designer, when you are going to be in the real world, which I think is also kind of an interesting framing as well, given that many of our students are already in the real world, at least by half, we forget to just think about them as already practicing as designers, and that these are ways of thinking and knowing and doing things that they can strengthen as they move through their education, whether it is undergraduate or graduate and so on. And I think that that's just a very different way to think about what is the machine, of the school itself, which I don't want to get into here in this discussion, but there are things about who the students are, why they're there, and what is the framework that they're operating in that drive much of what goes on in the classroom and beyond the classroom, and spills over into what we are now framing as the real world as separate from academia.
As you just said and mentioned in your article, what the curriculum should focus on is to make the designer you already have a better designer. But could you define what is a good designer, and how do you evaluate if you succeeded in teaching the students to be better versions of themselves?
Well, I think that's a magic question. How do you evaluate in a scenario where you can't just have a checklist and like check off like, okay, now the student knows how to do this and now they know how to do this. And we still use those rubrics throughout all of our curricula. And I have to say, like, while what I just said may sound unstructured, I really deeply believe in structure to also, or actually, let me just back up and also say, it's more important for the student, in fact, to know whether they know things than it is even for us to know if they know things, and for them to understand what they need to learn in order to achieve whatever they see as their next level. And I think that's like really, especially in terms of assessing, is what you're doing working? A lot of what we're looking at is like, we for example, run a couple of different types of, like, we have grades in our school for various structural reasons. The grades don't operate the way they should. So we actually do multiple types of assessment outside of grades that are also quantitative to help students understand where they lay in a sort of set of benchmarks. I mentioned this in the article at some point. I don't know if I left it in, but we were actually looking at ways that even other organizations, like even the Navy, like looks at how to assess whether people in training are meeting the requirements of like what they're being asked to do. And it's kind of trying to get back at, and this goes back to the also the student, themselves wanting to be excellent and successful, and like what they think that is versus what we think it is versus what people outside think it is. I think having a much broader perspective of all of those things is really necessary if you're going to have someone moving forward in what they're going to do. This is also a matter of the variety of, this might be different in other schools, but in our school, out of 100 and some students coming into a class, like a single class, the range from one student to the next is enormous. And so you do need to have some kind of flexible system that is not anything goes system to be able to understand, has the student advanced or not? But practically on the ground, I would say using multiple forms of assessment is how we do that.
Okay, yes. I when I was reading the article, I did put a note about, you were talking about getting the students across the finish line. And then I did put a note like, okay, so what is the finish line? You know, is there one finishing line, or is it around like attitudes? So you've just kind of responded to a question that I did have, you know, where are we trying to get them to?
The finish line for me, which I think is really, I still have never quite achieved it. So it's like one of those asymptotic things, is for the student to feel fully in control of their education, like moving forward when they step outside of the school. I mean, that would be the goal. And I, you know, I'm not alone in saying that. Many of the articles throughout both issues have said that. But it takes a lot to do that, given the current environment and value system that students are coming out of, you know, where accumulating a certain amount of things on the resume or credits or GPAs or whatever is like considered to be a mark of like how valuable the student is as a human. And so the idea that, you know, that they are actually, it's really hard to locate that ability to say, you know what, if I need to learn this, or if I want to learn this, I can do it. This is how I'm going to go about it. This is how I'm going to begin. Like, these are all things that are missing from those existing systems. And I think it takes at least 4 years actually to undo some of that, if at all. And we're not wholly successful, and I doubt anybody is in doing that.
Okay. Jumping in again. So like one thing that I really appreciated in the article was how you articulated translation, creation, and articulation as the three main qualities of design education. You know, I myself have been trying to find 3 words like that. I have 3 words, and I use 3 completely different words. So, you know, when I read then the translation, creation, articulation, I thought, okay, this is interesting. And actually it doesn't include my 3 words at all, you know, which were empathy, facilitation, and collaboration. And maybe these are not even like design skills per se, but, you know, if I think about the way I want my students to, what I want them to develop as they leave it, you know, those are the ones that I focus on, you know, empathy, can they work with others, you know, and how can they facilitate some conversations between people. So you chose your 3. Can you think of others that you might have forgotten, or maybe that you had to leave out?
Well, I was looking for, and I should also say, like, those are created with my colleagues at the school, and I was thinking about what is specific to communication design, like not like design in general, but like what is specific to communication design. Like, I come from an architecture background. I did not go to graphic design school for my undergrad, and you know, that shaped me in a particular way of seeing the world, or looking at how to resolve things, or like looking at everything in relationship to each other, for example, is one of the key elements of an architectural education. Everything is situated. You know, there's no living outside of context, you know, like in that sense. I mean, you can, but like there's a lot of tension there. But for you know, for communication design, like much of what you do is operate with content. You know, like you are using and translating content 99% of the time, and there is a lot that one of the difficult things is having students continuously disregard the content in using content. And so translation for us is a really helpful term to try to introduce students to the idea that they're not just, you know, kind of painting the surface of somebody else's words, but that they are actually translating that content into another context, another medium, another audience. Because this is also, I mean, most of our students are international, and it's something that they already feel confident that they can do. So when you start to translate that into the context of a project, then they start to understand, oh, well, this is something I know how to do already. I can start moving that into my work and like think about my work in a different sense. As for creation, a lot of times we talk about making and craft are used a lot in design discussions, design education discussions, but they tend to sort of veer off into other directions. Like making in my school, so we have a whole design and technology program that, for them, making is kind of just making stuff, like without a program, without, it's tinkering, like in a way, and a very productive tinkering, but it's tinkering. And like when in the communication design context, like the prototyping that happens there is not tinkering, like it is in response to a condition or an audience. And so I think it's important. And also sometimes you create ideas rather than things, so like, what is that? What does it mean to do something that hasn't happened before? And I'm often talking to students about, well, what can you do in that team context that other people can't do? And actually being able to imagine what the future is and actually show what that could look like. That really is the job of the communication designer in most of those teams. They're not solving problems per se, like that's an engineer's issue. They're actually trying to imagine like what could go wrong, like what if, like those are creation, that's where creation comes in. It's like it proposes something that wasn't there before. And for articulation, it absolutely, again, trying to undo the perception that the designer is somebody who just makes stuff, right? Without the articulation to multiple audiences, not just audience as an end user audience, but also teammates, the engineers and business people, especially business people. It's really, I don't know, like the value of the designer is very low, like without that ability to articulate design decisions continuously on the ground. And this is not just like selling an idea, like this is really explaining like why something needs to be the way that it needs to be because of something that might happen in the future. So like that needs to be addressed, I think, very, very in a very straight way and not a kind of side presentation issue.
While Nora think about her next question, we have in the chat a comment from Don Norman. He said, both this panel and the preceding one still talks about the individual designer. But in today's world, with the complex societal needs that designers should address, the work must require teams of multiple disciplines. We don't train students to work with other disciplines as equals. So I invite everyone, not just this panel, all of you to comment on this.
Well, I do want to break in here though, first, just to say, this perception that students are being continuously taught, by the thousands to work on their own, to like make their own little special thing. That has not been my experience for the last 10 years. It might have been my experience 20 years ago. But, at this point, it's actually, even the tools don't allow for that kind of individuality in the same way. It's not happening in the workplace, and it's not really happening so much in school anymore. But my big issue about the collaboration is if you cannot communicate your ideas to other people, you cannot collaborate. Like you actually first need to work on your ability to communicate and know, like, what do they know that that you can use to explain what it is that you're trying to explain, and then you can collaborate. So for example, like we have a lot of specialized language in things like typography, and I have a tendency to try to get my students to tune backwards from that so that they can actually talk to people who don't know anything about typography about why it matters. So like if you can't make that possible, like that kind of communication possible, there is no collaboration without that. But I leave it to my colleagues here to.
Juan?
I would like to go farther than what Juliette is saying, and I think that that's one of the important things about design is that it's not just a matter of like us communicating, it's us creating ways in which people can communicate. And I think that that's one of the values of the tangible, of like creating objects, not just as a solution, going back to what we were saying, but also as ways in which we can engage people into a conversation. When we facilitate this vision of the future, when we facilitate these ideas and we make them tangible, we also facilitate how people interact with those ideas of the future and can express better their ideas and can express better their concern about the things that we're discussing about. I think that that's a value of design that we have to encourage in our students, is that it's not just a matter of like, we're good at communication. It's what we're good at using some of those tools of communication to ensure that the co-construction of that reality happens.
I would say, yeah, I agree with Juliette 100%. This is not an issue that I've encountered in the last 20 years. I did have an interesting conversation one day with John Seeley Brown, who you'll know from his work in Xerox PARC. And what he suggested is, why don't we admit not individual students, but students as teams? So before I go to apply to university, I've decided on some sort of project that we're going to work on, and I'll need an accountant and a designer and a marketer and a, whatever it might be, an engineer. And I collect up all those people and we apply for admission, get admitted, and then are taught, each of us, to fill our role as we go through the school. So I proposed that a few times now, and mostly what I hear in response is a sound a bit like crickets.
Well, I mean, I'll add to the crickets though. I mean, how exclusive can you possibly, it's like if you're only going to admit students who already know an engineer, for example, like who exactly are we talking about? And how, and this is like one of the frameworks I find really interesting, or when I started at Parsons as director, and one of my friends asked, well, do you want to run a modeling agency or the Marines? Like, which one do you want to do? Is your talent going to be in selection, or is it going to be in setting up like parameters and frameworks to like build people up from where they are? And obviously we chose the latter, but it always stands out in my mind like how much we confuse the two. And oftentimes, like, when we get frustrated, we're like, well, maybe we should do a better job of selecting who's coming in. And I would actually argue we need to do a better job of teaching the students that we have, because most of the time we don't even have any control over that. I mean, some of you in graduate programs might, and even then I can hear a lot of dissatisfaction, I should say, in that selection. So, what then? Because, these are the people who have elected to take this path of learning design. And like, we have to know what they know and then build on that.
Ken?
Yeah, I think there's something that's worth noting. I can't see how students are going to find out all the people who ought to be on their team, because they'd have to do a whole search process. But what is a one way to work that works very successfully is that the design lab at Aalto University, students come from whatever disciplines they come from. Every year, companies come and pitch projects to the students. And this is so successful that every year they get more companies pitching fully funded projects without any requirements of an outcome. They always learn something, but exactly what they learn differs each time. And then what happens is when the companies pitch, all the students will be in a big room, and the students who are interested in a specific project all gather. So they usually wind up with teams of people from engineering and the sciences, from design and architecture and the arts, and also from business and the management areas, because all of these faculties provide students to the design lab, even though it's located in the School of Technology. So that is one way to do it. But to ask students to form a team to apply for a program, I can't see a way to manage it without an enormous amount of prior investment by the university.
I do want to plus
yet,
one that, like, we do that at Cornell Tech, and it's great, like the teaming of things.
Well, and if I could say, Juliette, the students apply to be an engineer or to go into business school. They're coming out of high school and they're choosing a trajectory. So the only difference is they will have got together with some people. Maybe we run some mixers ahead of time. Maybe they all come from the same place. But the idea would be that.
What about the reason I like the Alto method is kids come from Sweden and Portugal and Italy and Finland and Norway, and they'd have never met each other in advance.
Yeah, as an international person, someone who's an international student, I just immediately think, but how would I be able to find a team? There are some. I agree with what Juliette was saying about having some exclusivity or some barriers to inclusion with that teaming idea. I think it is interesting. I actually currently teach students who are not design students and come from then all over the university. And I know a lot of other people teach classes like that. And these classes are both challenging and interesting, because the students bring their own perspectives to the way the problems are addressed. I'll agree again with you, Juliette, that, because my students are not coming from the same background, where I wanted to agree is that they are working in teams. They're not really working individually at all in the class that I teach, because they are kind of trying to feed off of each other to quickly acquire these design skills, and then borrow these competencies that they have, that the others might have as they work together to, even when they're working in theory on individual projects, they're still collaborating with others. So maybe the individual designer that existed like in the 80s and the 90s, that kind of rock star designer, maybe we are moving away from that kind of profile in design education.
We're moving now I think in the discussion already into implementation issues, right? Yeah. But I miss actually what's the point? If you look at, we're talking about education, what's the purpose of education? So, and if we start looking at it from this point of view, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things that, let's focus on the university education is doing, right? We focus on knowledge imparting and so forth, enabling people growing as a professional, but that's only part of the story. The other story is we are certifying people so that when employers look at the diploma and say, yeah, let's get him in or her in because can do. And there's also the marketability of the person that comes into play. So when you look at these programs of education, it's not only about getting people to work in interdisciplinary teams. I'm being a bit simplistic now, but it's about more than that. And again, we have been talking about how do we break down the silos, in fact, right? I mean, so all these specialists and bringing them together. Sure, we need to do that, but knowledge is developed in the silos, right? You have the specialist in physics, in engineering, in business. These are the people at the edge, right? So we need those people. At the same time, they need more and more increasingly to have all these horizontal skills, if you so like, communication, right? So how can an engineer communicate in a way that the designer understands, right? And this is a real challenge. Other skills like collaboration. Maybe we need to have new silos, right? People that focus on specializing in collaboration. That's all they do. So they don't know anything about physics or about business or anything else, right? But they are very good at bringing people at the table and talking, right? Getting them to communicate. This would be like a new discipline in a way, right? We're trying to now pack everything into one. You have to become the specialist that can talk to everybody and integrate. I think that's very, very difficult, especially at the level of that we're talking here, right? These are people who are fairly young, right? We're still learning the ropes, if you so like. And the people I see that can do this really well tend to be more the seasoned type of professional, right? This is not discriminatory, exclusive, anything like that. Just an observation of empirical experience, if you like. What a bad formulation. But anyway, yeah, so when we talk about these things, I think it's important that we provide an area of practice in our studies, like projects, teamwork, and so forth, right? Without neglecting that the real power that these people will have in terms of providing solutions and so forth comes from the specialization, right? So this is a really, really big issue. I didn't have this when I was studying, right? I didn't have to worry about other disciplines. They were interesting, but that was pretty much it. Today, you have to sit at the table with them and speak the same language somehow, or find the common language, even worse, right? So this is, I think, one of the challenges that we are facing in education at university level right now.
Don, you have raised your hand. I can imagine that as a person with multiple disciplines background, you have some comments on this. Please go ahead.
Well, thank you. I found that the discussion has been interesting, but it didn't quite address the real question that I had. Here, I can show myself.
Hello.
Just changing the height of my table to be better for the video. We have two kinds of problems that we have to face. And actually, I'm developing a short talk I'm going to give tomorrow morning to our future of design education. It starts off by saying 50 years ago, Victor Papanek said that, you know, there is no profession more evil than design. Well, maybe there is. It's advertising, which causes people to buy the crap the designers build, et cetera, et cetera. Well, he was both right and wrong, but that was 50 years ago. But the real issue is that today, designers, I think we do a really good job as being guiding industry, making products, making, you know, doing communication tools, et cetera, but we need to go beyond that. Because even when we're in industry, most designers are at middle levels because they haven't been educated in looking at the broader issues. And that's why I thought the first panel, for example, which said, let's back up and look at the ethics of where we come from and where we're going, was very, very important. We have to really ask bigger questions, and designers sometimes ask those questions, but they're seldom in a position of power to put them into action. And that's where this multidisciplinary work comes in. And it isn't that we must work with other kinds of designers. We must also work with the other disciplines, which I know you've all said. But don't forget, it isn't that we have to communicate our ideas better to them. We also have to learn how to listen to them, because we have to change what we are doing. And now when we start to look at societal issues, designers have been taught, in fact, I do this. If you read what I tell people how you should design, is that, well, we send out the anthropologists to try to understand what the real issues are in the community. And then we do our ideation, and then we do our tests, and we test, and then we deliver to the people. Here's the solution to your problems. And that's wrong, and that's evil. Because it's basically colonization. Instead of a nation coming and colonizing another nation, it's designers trying to colonize people's behavior. And so I think that requires a very different kind of education. And it's actually not a novel idea. The word co has been applied to many kinds of design: co-design, participatory design, collaborative design, community design. And here the designer plays a different role. But it is very multidisciplinary, but actually the designer is a mentor and a facilitator as opposed to proposer of solutions. So I'm thinking big about how we can change design to be a part of the solutions to all of the problems that we face in this world, not just the technical solvers. And it is true that we need specialists and we need generalists, and it's very rare that the same one person can be both. We need a team that has the different specialties, and we need a team that has the generalists who can actually bring them together. Now, actually in industry, when you're doing a product, there's usually a person called a product manager. And these people can be educated in anything. A lot of the ones I've seen have degrees in English. Doesn't matter. When I worked at Apple, as I say, a very technical product would have an English major watching over it. But the important point was that that person could step back, and when there were disagreements going on, could say, well, what's best for the customer? What's best for the person who's going to use the product? And could neutralize, because every discipline thinks that whatever they do is the most important thing in the world. And personally, you have to think that, because otherwise, why would you be doing it if you didn't think it was important? But in fact, in the end, when you're trying to solve the sanitation problem in a rural community in India, say, you can't view the world that way. Anyway, that's enough.
Juan, you also raise your hand, and I invite all the panelists to engage in a discussion with Don. Please go ahead.
I have two little things that I was thinking. The first one is that being recently working with communities and participatory design processes, you realize that there is a need for design to be more open, but there's also a need to be more aware of the role that we have. And I think that the disciplinary process, going to what Jorge Frascara was saying in the chat, is we need to have that learning process of what we are and who we are, and an acknowledgement of that agency that we have in the process. So building the world is not something that is going to happen that requires people who knows how to deal with the process of construction, right? So we're not going to build a house. We need someone who is a specialist on building that house, but we are part of a process. And how do we access this agency that other people has on that construction of that house and that future that implies that construction of the house? How do we access that agency that people should have on deciding what is the future that they want for their reality? And I think that that's a big thing. It's not just either erasing the individual design or encouraging it. It's finding that balance in between. How do we use the things that we have, the tools that we have, to facilitate that co-construction of that sense of what the future could be? But because that's a negotiation, it's not something that it's a given. And the second one, I think that going back to what Don Norman was saying, is that this idea of complexity has a lot to do with the fact that I love how Bruce Edmonds says that, complexity is something that exists in the system. We just sometimes we don't see it because we don't have to. We try to erase it in order to facilitate the process of moving forward, right? So in order to give a step, we don't constantly see every single repercussion, because if not, we wouldn't move forward, right? But the thing is that the level of, in the past, we were building one thing, right? Or 100 or 1,000. Now we're building millions. So the density and the complexity of the things that we're dealing right now, because of interconnection, because of production, mass production, because of transportation, everything that has happened, resources, the amount of people that we have, the density of the system is so thick right now that we cannot just ignore that complexity that happens inside that we used to do before in order to produce. It's the time that we have to move students into saying, in the past we ignore it because it was easier for us to produce, ignoring that complexity. Now, like it or not, we have to deal with it. We have to deal with that complexity. We have to start increasing the resolution of what we see of reality, and seeing that little details that are encompassed inside the systems that we're dealing with in a different way. That's my perspective. I think that's the reason why we can no longer have the same design that we had 20, 30, 50 years ago. It's not just because design changes, it's because society changes and the way we produce changes. And the responsibility of producing something is no longer the same that we had before, right?
Juliette, go ahead.
I would like to hear from the student that we have on the panel here.
Yes, from what I understood, I think it's very important, and Juliette, you said that in your paper, to see the individual person, because it's not interesting to make all designers similar, because the power of the area of design is that we are all different. We all bring a different perspectives. And so I think, and we read something like this in class, that it's really important to empower each of the students to know what are their strengths and weaknesses and how to use them to have a great impact on their work later. So how would you, if you agree with me, empower each individual and make them be confident about their own strength to use them wisely in collaboration?
I would say like it requires a lot of validation on the ground. I mean, we're all validation junkies now. Speaking of Instagram, you know, it's like there's me, middle-aged person talking in the classroom versus 1.9 million likes. Guess who wins, right? You know, so I think one is to understand your own need for validation and vary like the kinds of validation that will move you forward. I think is like one of the biggest parts of that. But then also just like the different visions, like I you know, in a lot of this you know, framing, I hear things like, you know, water systems in India or healthcare systems, you know, hospital intake, you know, for example. My students, when asked to imagine what their future is, like they don't hit anywhere near that. It's like you know, the greatest aspiration is to be Virgil Abloh. It is not to be Milton Glaser. The greatest, if I ask, the saddest one of all is like, I'll usually speak to incoming students and I'll say, what is your dream? And they'll say, my dream is to be an intern at Vogue. And so, and again, like once I'm past the initial shock, and it's been 10 years, so I'm past the initial shock, then I ask, okay, well, what can we do? What can we do with that? And how do you also not make, you know, it's not anyone's fault if like they weren't surrounded by people designing hospital intake systems or any of these things. You know, it's like you don't choose the family and environment that you're usually coming from. I don't see the point of university education if it's not different from your home life. That's a whole other maybe more controversial thing to say. But then how do we actually show students that these things do exist and they're actually quite interesting? And I think that there's a missing step there often of you know, bringing people in and saying like, okay, well, what do you do? And then they're like, oh, you know, I design this and that at the, you know, in the hospital. And then suddenly that becomes interesting, but that step has to happen before someone can envision that they themselves could occupy that. Because otherwise, you know, making Instagram tiles or whatever is usually seems good enough. You know, like the dreams are usually pretty small coming in. And I think some dream expansion is necessary during that time. And that is part of what we do as educators. And I just want to say, like, it's really that I think it's important to be able to imagine yourself in a multiple variety of situations. And I think for the majority of the students that I teach, the worlds that have been painted out for them are actually quite small, and not even like limited by income even. It's just like, this is where you belong. You need to be in a creative career, you know, whatever that means. And then they need to be able to expand out from there.
Juliette, do you think that students that want to start a program or study design come with misperception or a narrow perception of design? How will you see it? And how can we overcome that? Because that would be a barrier for most programs.
If design is an alphabet, they have like one letter, you know, they have G, and then we have to kind of get the rest to see as a possibility. But Leslie, did you want to say something?
No, I was just wondering then, you know, I was thinking back to the first conversation where we talked about values and ethics. And actually, like, you know, yesterday I was in a conversation about ethics and design. And I had to think about how we didn't talk about ethics. I studied in the 90s. We never spoke about ethics, but I wonder if, you know, ethics and values and things like that could help expand the frame a little bit more. And that was, you know, because I've been talking about ethics so much and inclusion and stuff like that, that was one question that I also had in your framework, you know, translation, creation, articulation. I just wondered where the ethics, where does that come in? in that framework.
Well, I mean, I think also speaking of ethics, which I'm glad that everyone has talked about this today. You know, I hope we also can learn from engineering and business that just having a class in ethics that's on the side, you know, that's your 1 credit thing doesn't work, right? So what we do, and we teach interaction from the 2nd year. We don't do it. You know, we start with interaction rather than ending with it, and we very deeply talk about bias, inclusivity, all of that stuff, like from the get-go, and it's integrated into the studio class. And that's like one of the battles actually that we have at our school is allowing for the integrated class. And like, if we've done anything right, it's been that, and it has to do with, I mean, it's actually just an artifact of like various political battles, but when it has to happen side by side with the teaching of like, you know, how does GitHub work? You know, then there has to be the discussion of, you know, how do these systems leave people in or out? And we have a tendency to want to separate these out into classes. One of the wonderful things, by the way, about teaching online, which I know has been enormously stressful for most of us, has been the ability to really integrate all of these things into one studio class, because we're all in the same screen. Like, there's no need to be in a separate place, you know, to do any of these things. And I think that that's, so I guess my overall is that ethics has to be integrated into all 3 of those categories all the way through. Like, you cannot be making things without asking, like, who is this for? What does it mean that I direct all of that the only audience I can think of is like this one specific audience? Like, how can I expand that? But that's part of that should be part of each of those categories. It cannot be separated.
Juliette, if I may, I think that there's something in that the 20th century and the 21st century brought us to design as methods. And I think that they're amazing. But I also think that there's an issue with that, is that there are certain things that are excluded from methods because they're so narrow sometimes. It's like, you know, find a solution. I think that, to your point, is that, you know, values and ethics and morals should be included in the methods. It's no longer something we can avoid. It's something that we have to include, not just as a tangential thing, not just, as you were saying, as a class on the side, or what Professor Norma was saying, as a class on the side. It's not that anymore. It's part of what we have to be discussing on the process of design as a main thing.
See, Dawn and Nora were moving their head, so Dawn, please go ahead, then Nora.
Just want to emphasize that point. So part of the philosophy that we're dealing with when we're trying to rethink how we do design education is that some topics are too important to be in a course. They have to be integrated throughout the entire program. And that's, which is actually what you are saying. So I just want to re-emphasize that.
But also, to follow from what you had said before, I just want to comment that you know, dropping design methods down onto a community, onto a situation, onto all of that too, is another way to not really think about like whose values, whose ethics, you know. So you know, I think that was really important for you to say earlier as well.
Nora, would you like to comment on that?
Yes, when you talk about ethics, are you talking about the value that we have and the right or wrong that we think are, or I'm not sure I understood that.
When I speak of ethics, I think of like, what is your sense of responsibility to the people who are ultimately not involved in the creation of the things that you make? So, you know, obviously the business person has a role, the engineer has a role, the designer has a role, but, you know, who speaks for the person who is now like believes that we're being hit with lasers from space, right? You know, so like, who sticks up for that person? So for me, like ethics is partially that. Ethics in I mean, this is a tangent, but like ethics is also just about honesty and truth. And I have, in communication design in particular, which is mostly built around like making things not look like what they are. That's also, I think, a kind of ethical discussion that always has to happen. Like, what is the difference between what things look like and what they are? And what is your responsibility in that?
Jorge and Don?
I just want to emphasize that, oh, I'm sorry, was I second? Well, it's just short. And maybe Leslie should answer this, but what happens when we are working in a community where we think, strong, appropriate ethical values, and the community doesn't agree? The community has very different ethical values. And as we work across the world, we have to respect the values of the communities that we're working in, even though they may be completely opposite of what we believe in. Leslie, you've been working on that problem.
I have, and I treat the question, if I get the question of what are ethics, I actually answered a different way, because I've been thinking of ethics as guiding principles. And to get people to think of ethics, I've been actually asking people to create their personal manifestos, because once they can start to figure out, okay, well, these are the principles that are important to me, then they start to make decisions that are ethical, because they've established and made their values public, and then the ethics seems to follow. But you're right. Then the question becomes, okay, whose ethics, are more important? And I would say yes, the people that we are working with, we would then step back, and their ethics would be the ethics that come forward.
Yeah, but ethics are in a way a contract, right? So ethics are based on values. So if I value, for instance, life because I think life is sacred, right? Or if I say, I think killing is bad, totally different, right? We still both have the ethics of not killing anything, right? So we're coming from different areas, but we're coming together with one common ethical concept or value there, right? It's a contract. So by the values, right, may be coming from all over the place, but then sitting at the table, you have to come up with what's ethical for our group, for our society, for our way of looking at things. I think in these ethical courses that I have seen and the stuff that I've read, we're looking for like the ultimate, right? This is ethical, this is not unethical, because that's the way it is, right? And I don't see that. If you look at the history of humanity, what was ethical and not ethical has changed over time as we learn more, as we develop more, as we have different opportunities, different possibilities, different technologies, right? All these things influence our possibilities to be or not be ethical, right? So, but it comes back to values. You can negotiate between different value systems to create an ethical system that we can both agree on and make that our common ground that determines good or acceptable behavior and unacceptable behavior. That's what ethics are about, right?
No, you're forgetting what was said earlier about the importance of a complex system. Let me give you two ethical values. One is that everyone has the right to live, to have food, and not to freeze to death. And everybody has a right to be free of disease. And these two conflict with each other. We see it today, absolutely today in southern United States, where suddenly in Texas, which is normally a warm place, people are freezing to death. And there's no electricity, there's no water, no heat, no food. And so they want to cluster together, but if you cluster together, you transmit coronavirus and people get COVID-19 and they die from it. And so we want to keep people separated and apart from each other. On the other hand, we want to keep them alive and fed. And these are two ethical dilemmas. We agree about both principles, but they conflict with each other. How do you deal with that?
Well, that's where the designer comes in and has to come up with a way we can do both, right? So because I'm sure you can find a way to let everybody be warm and at the same time be safe from disease. Maybe you can put on a coat, one of these spacesuits things types of that you see.
Well, we don't jump to the solution. That's against. But
no. Just as an example, right?
No, what I'm trying to say is that there was a discussion earlier about how complex the world is. I think maybe you're the one who said it, Jorge. So that even in the ethical situation, one community may have very different values than my values, but it's even worse when the two communities agree upon their values, but those values themselves cannot all be accommodated at the same time. So you have to figure out which one is most important. And
yeah, but if that's the case, they haven't really agreed on it. They have come to do what most people in those situations do, which is a compromise. So for
we
you,
all agree about the value of life, but
work.
then talk to the people who believe in abortion versus not abortion. It's a complex issue.
Yeah, and then the question might be why, right? And then maybe that way you can find something. But I agree with you. I mean, there's no way we can do this, right? That it fits everybody. But yet,
our students have to understand it. That's the main
finding that one thing. So I don't have a solution for it. Otherwise, I would be probably getting Nobel Prizes or something. But the idea is that, I mean, it's how do you cope with this, right? Because we need to cope. Look at what's happening in society today, right? I mean, all these things about nationalism and so forth is giving way to groups with different types of ethics and especially values, starting with values, right? That's where it's playing now. So the question is, if you have that in your teams, how do you manage this? How do you agree to work with this, right? People who have opposing views, right? I mean, yeah, I think that's the thing that you need to be sensibilized in school. In school, we cannot tell them what is right and what is wrong, right? That is not something that we can say for sure. I mean, look at the philosophy, right? I mean, it's plagued with that kind of stuff, and we still don't have a solution. So I don't think that we can aim for that, right? But we have to find a way how to deal with those type of situations that we can do in school.
Juan?
And I think that there's an issue in there, and the issue is that the whole point of design is moving forward. I mean, it's like you have to give the next step. And I think that there's, at the end, is a process of negotiation. It's how do you negotiate with people? How do you help them negotiate between them? Like, what is their perception of what the future should be, what the future could be, what the future, it aligns with their reality. And I think that it goes farther, because even here we're discussing about ideas of future that are based on Western society. I mean, we're discussing on ideas of a future that are based on whether or not we like, or we're against something or not. But if you go farther into reality and we extend it and we talk about like indigenous communities or like ancestral communities, their perception of the future is completely different. So we're dealing and we're negotiating this future of technology and space travels and stuff like that, when there's communities that are negotiating a different type of future. And then the inclusion that we have in that process is so limited that when we talk about this idea of values and moral and moving into the future and this negotiation between, Democrats and Republicans, and look at it wider and broader, and then you find something that's completely different. I mean, I mentioned in a conversation with Lucy Suchman that my dad grew up in the mountains with an indigenous community. And one of the things that they say in Colombia is that all Western civilization are just teenagers playing with their toys, and they're waiting for us to reach their level of understanding of reality. And in that sense, you can say like, oh, that's illusion. But in the other sense, you can say like, maybe they're right, right? And where we're trying to focus our perception of what the future is, we're just aiming to something that we assume is the right path, but it's not necessarily inclusive.
Can you tell us about the patching the hole in the mountain?
I mean, there's so many things that you find on that process. I remember one of the things is that we were writing a paper on how to work with something that happens in Colombia that is like flooding on certain areas. And we were like trying to do some research about it from the design perspective, right? And then we realized that issue was solved 500 years ago. And that they had the largest system of water supply in the Americas. And it was just destroyed by the principle. It wasn't destroyed by someone, it was destroyed by a principle. The principle was property. So as soon as they said to the indigenous people, like, you own a piece of land, then the whole construction of like the area as a collective was destroyed. So I think that those are things that you start finding. And I think that the design, as you were saying before, design has this issue of like, sustaining that status quo, that is, it's based on the idea that, the system is running, we just patch you know, the little hole, we do this analysis of like the little hole, and then we patch it and we keep running. And at the end, the question of whether or not we're going into the right direction is not raised.
Or we build a spacesuit to solve the heat problem.
Leslie, you are well known for your approach to teaching with an ethical view, embracing different views. Can you please comment on that?
Well, I was thinking while Juan was talking, I was thinking about relationality, which is something that I did think, you know, I sometimes think is missing from design education in the US. I don't know if it's there in other places, but because in other places people relate in different ways, perhaps. I mean, sometimes I'm worried that I'm being like nostalgic or romantic, you know, being a bit of a romanticist when I say this, but, you know, I think that what I've been trying to do in the way that I've been teaching and the way that I've been writing is to focus on these, you know, slowing things down and building relationships, really looking and seeing people as they talk, you know, to get information in a different way and then move forward. So, you know, I may not be answering really your question, Guillermina, but that's what I was hearing when Juan was speaking, that I was thinking that, okay, there's that element of relationality. You know, if we slowed things down, we would be able to listen to people who would tell us about, okay, things that were done before and, you know, other ways of being and knowing, and then we can take this into our design. And so I think that that's, you know, if I have to think about the design of now, and what they need, or educating the designer of now, I think that one element is that they need to know how to listen, how to see, how to relate with people who are different, and then take that forward, you know. And then I think that we have been talking a little bit about content, and the reality is that the content for the designers that we're educating is going to be completely different by the time they are practicing. You know, even, you know, my career, I graduated 20 years ago and would never have known what is UX and UI. And, you know, so I mean, we have to really think about all of these like bigger questions. And so I come back to my simplicity of empathy, facilitation, and collaboration as like my big three things. I'm not in communication design, but I'm really just, those are the three things that I'm focusing on as I teach.
You build a lot on your teaching on the theories of Paulo Freire. Do you think that that could help us?
Yes, okay, very specifically. Yes, because Freire is teaching us to have people bring in their own lived experiences into the classroom and the way that we teach, you know. And then so in the way that we work, in the way that we teach as designers, we do have to think of how are we allowing the students to really bring their lived experience into the classroom so that they are learning from each other, and then we are also learning from them, you know. And then when we're doing the community work, well, whatever the community work is, it's the same kind of thing, you know. How do we make sure that the people that we're working in with are bringing their expertise to the project, and then again, we are learning from them, you know. So it's how do we build these dialogical relationships between people who might be considered teachers and people who might be considered learners, understanding that these roles are also fluid. So I think that, yes, we can bring these things. I'm certainly trying to bring this into the work that I'm doing in educating the design of now, you know, trying to blur these relationships a bit so that there's more mutual teaching and learning going on.
And a comment for all of you, and in a way going back to Juliette's article, that starts discussing or wondering, shall we prepare designers to find a shop? Shall we prepare designers for a future? Shall we prepare designers for disciplines, even design disciplines or problems that do not exist now? Should they be problem solvers? So what are your views, and how can we help future designers?
I know I just spoke, but I'll speak quickly again. I don't think the jobs exist, right? And I actually heard that. We had this conversation, Guillermina, that, you know, when I was in college, my professor said, there are no jobs for you people, right? And it actually was the most empowering thing to hear, because it then freed me from looking for a job. You know, I just left university and thought, okay, I won't get a job. And I did not look for a job for at least 5 or 10 years. You know, I just learned to hustle and to, you know, to do, yeah, I brought that design education into real life. And so I think the design education is about thinking. And so how we going to get people to think so that they can make themselves relevant as they move through life.
Thank you.
I agree with what you said, and that it's not a bad thing that we don't know exactly what we're going to do later. But if I think about the USA, and that it's really different from Switzerland, because I think it's much more expensive to go to school in the USA, and that then the decision of the school doesn't depend only on the students, but also on the parents, because they are the ones who are going to finance the studies. So if as a parent you have your child and you have to invest a lot of money, but it's not like your child is going to a law university and you know, okay, my child is going to be either an attorney or judge or something. I know it's possible, but then I have no idea how. Don't you think it has a negative impact on the enrollment, that the people cannot have a clear idea because the unknown is scary? So, and how do you deal with that?
Which is where all of those pictures are provided. But I do want to also kind of highlight like the word investment, you know, and like what you just said, you know, the idea that a child is an investment, or that in a university education is an investment, is kind of a new, like when I was in college, and I went to like a land grant university 20 years ago, 30 years ago, probably at this point, like that wasn't the way it was framed. And now it is so commonplace to think of it that way. And to the degree that when I ask my like first year, our second year students, like, well, why did you choose communication design? I realize I have to back up and ask, did you choose communication design? Because in many cases they didn't. Like that was actually laid out for them. They met with a counselor and their parents, and they said, you know, given that you you screwed up your SATs, and like you don't have you're creative, but you know you need to be a productive member of society by making money, otherwise you're not worth anything. Then that they end up with communication design. And I think this is something that is hard for people who are older, I include myself in this, to really comprehend. Like it is 20 years of that kind of thinking that needs to be undone.
Ken?
Yeah, I do want to say, while in one way I agree with Juliette, I got to point out that for the last couple of centuries, aspirational families from many, many cultures, both in Europe and in North America and in Asia, have definitely urged their children to get educations and seek careers that would raise the status and the future of the family and of the individual. They didn't use the word of investment, but they definitely pushed them towards places. Jesus, all of my cousins are physicians or lawyers. And you go to some campuses and you see enormous numbers of Asian American students in North America because their parents want them to succeed. So I agree that they don't use the term investment, but they're definitely pushing their kids to prosper and to bring the family up in society.
But just a little detail, I think that there's a change when you say investment. I think that it's not just I agree with you, and in Latin America it's the same. It's like this, centuries of like families trying to get like moving forward and being, increasing or improving their quality of life. But I also think that there's certain things that start. I mean, if you look at the example of not just education, but health, when you see it as a business and you see it as clients and you see it as an investment, it changes profoundly what you're doing. I don't think it is an empty word. I think that there's a sense that it's been growing, but it's a sense on that.
This goes back to your property question. It's just like that.
Good.
Yeah, but I was just thinking that Nora brought up a really good point, you know, by talking about the cost of education, you know, that really does eliminate the kind of risk that some of us might have been able to take, you know, like when I studied in Brazil, as some of you know, and when I went to Brazil, the person who organized the thing said, well, if you don't like it, just come back home. But, you know, if I had spent hundreds of thousands of Trinidad dollars to go to the States, there wouldn't have been that, you know, it certainly would have put me on a different path educationally. So yeah, Nora, thank you for making that comment.
Good. Would someone else would like to comment on this for closing? What are we educating for? Jobs, life, problem solving? Stan.
I have one item that I don't think we've touched on yet. And again, it's just a sort of a footnote, but it comes from your own work, Guillermina. At some point in the process of working on interdisciplinary teams, you know, across multiple fields, there's a moment where the designer has to be an advocate for design. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure, you know, I've been thinking about it ever since you said it, and I'm not sure that I'm doing a good job of preparing them, mm-hmm. you know, to know when that moment is and to know how to advocate, you know, for our own expertise.
Yeah, that is true. We have to train future designers to advocate for design, and that is not easy when working with other disciplines, particularly because there is a misunderstanding of what we do. As we were talking before, some students have a misunderstanding of what is design when they start the program, but also some professionals have misunderstanding of what we do. Don.
I deal with a lot of designers who ask me, how do we convince our management that what we're doing is worthwhile, et cetera, et cetera. And designers don't know how to communicate. What they always try to do is explain the great value we offer and how our customers love what we do. And look at all the design prizes we've won. And I say, no, that's not how you convince anybody. What you have to do is understand your audience. And if you're working in a company, your audience, who's your customer? Your customer is your boss and your boss's boss, or maybe the boss of your boss's boss. And so you have to understand what motivates them. And in the company, in the end, it's about profits. And so you have to say why my work is going to be of value to the company, not to the people who are going to use it, to the company. I'm not saying that's always the answer, but what I'm saying is the principle is you have to think about who you are making the argument to, and you do it on their terms. And it's amazing how few people do that. And by the way, this is an aside, but it's a response to Juan a little bit. Or if you will, it's an adding to what you said. Because a lot of the discussion here was about, and I just did it, adding value, or it's an investment. And this is basically the Western capitalist system of government and economics. And I'm writing a paper with Escobar. So Escobar and I are really trying to say, and this has really been interesting because it took us like 3 or 4 months to be able to communicate with each other, because I'm also working with a few other people from Chile. So it's Chile, 2 people from Chile and people from Ecuador, and Colombia, and the United States. And the value systems are very different, especially because they were influenced by the philosophers, Heidegger especially, who's completely unintelligible to people like me. But we do have to change the whole system, because if we're basing our stuff on basically this is imperialism, and it's it's colonization, but we've been colonized by Western Europe. And I include North America, especially the United States, which is basically the values of Western Europe. And we're trying to apply it across the world and not necessarily in good ways. And I'm not opposed to democracy. I'm not opposed to the basic capitalist notions, but I am very definitely opposed, and most people in the other parts of the world are, to the way they have been implemented in the world. They're evil, they're corrupt, they are self-centered for the profitability and success of a few, powerful few. It's led to these horrible disparities. And these are the kinds of wicked problems that I think need to be attacked. And with wicked problems, as you know, are ones that are almost impossible to attack. Well, Arturo Escobar and I are going to do our little bit to see what we can do. But the important point, we can write a nice paper, but that won't change the world. We have to figure out what actions can be done to change the world.
Leslie?
Yeah, so a question that I had while I was reading the paper, and I've had it a couple of times throughout our talk, is like, so who is educating the designer of now? You know, we're talking about the design of now, and we're talking about the what, but we also have to talk about the who. And, you know, as we talk about like worldviews, you know, if these educators are all coming from the same background, all have the same worldview, I think that kind of narrows the scope then of and the way of thinking of this designer of the future that we are thinking about. And we really have to ask ourselves, you know, how are we going to get more different ways of thinking? And it's two things. It's a different ways of thinking and even the different types of content. I remember Dawn wrote something to the PhD list about designers needing to be the people who teach the other material that comes into our curriculum. I think Dawn probably doesn't even remember that. But, you know, there's that question about how are we going to get plurality of thought and perspective into the design curriculum of the future.
And I think this is a very complicated question. Again, it is our capitalistic structures that have determined the answers to those questions in ways that, you know, we're actively trying to dismantle, but it's a long road. And one thing that, you know, since Nora also touched on like some of the bigger questions here as well, you know, the 85% of our courses are taught by part-time faculty. I don't think that's we're unusual in that, you know, like many of them, especially the larger schools are like that. Most, there's a benefit to that. You know, they usually are bring their own worldviews, but the questions of who is able to operate like that, like who is able to teach at 12 o'clock in the afternoon in the middle of their day, it's incredibly limiting. The who is able to continue. We can always get somebody to teach for a semester or a year. Who can teach for 5 years or 10 years and actually build the skill of teaching? Who is allowed to do that? These are all, you know, for at least the American schools, you know, this is the question that is in front of us right now. And, you know, until we answer it, we're actually not, speaking of the future, we're not going to be creating designers for 2025 or 30 or 35 or beyond, because that world that we're being delivered into is a more pluralistic world and will have many different viewpoints coming into it, and will discard much of like that kind of single-minded thinking. So, but I think that's beyond the scope of the design professor to be able to really influence. Like that is the huge business question and a kind of structural question that I see a lot of like emotion about it, but I see very few people proposing viable solutions to it.
Good. I think that is good. A good point to close here. You have touched a lot of interesting aspects that we have to reflect on: ethics, values, designers for what, designers for whom, the issue of having a lot of sessionals. So how do we include that in our teaching? I would like to thank you, all of you. I think it has been a fantastic conversation, and that will trigger a lot of discussion or thinking in a lot of people. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye for now. Bye-bye.